Hello, my name is Cameron Wright, and it's great to be presenting virtually for this IPDLN meeting and what has been quite an unusual year. And our work is titled A Linked Data Analysis Exploring the Real-World Burden and Hospital-Related Cost of Sarcoma in Western Australia from 1982 to 2016. So my co-authors for this project are Georgia Halkett, Richard Carey-Smith, and Rachel Moran. And I've put a link to the published paper, which is available through BMC Cancer for people who might be interested in more detailed results following this presentation. So to begin with, what is sarcoma? So most cancers are what we call carcinomas. So these arise from epithelial cells. And so this is most of your typical breast, prostate, lung cancer, for example. Sarcomas are a little bit different in that they have a different precursor. So these are cancers arising from mesenchymal cells in the body. And you can see in the figure on the left that mesenchymal cells are precursors for a range of different tissues within the body, including bone and other connective tissue, fat, blood vessels, and so on. Sarcomas are much rarer than carcinomas, and because of genetic changes, they can arise earlier in life, although accumulated mutations do mean that sarcoma can arise in older age as well, as is the case with all cancers. So there's an example of a sarcoma on the right with this plain X-ray of this femur and pelvis. So you can see that there's a relative radiolucency just lateral to the lesser trochanter there of the femur, indicating an osteosarcoma or very suspicious fall. So where is the knowledge gap that led us to conducting this project? So because sarcoma is rare, centralised referral and management is a standard practice in Western Australia, and an understanding of the disease burden in terms of the sarcoma epidemiology is important to inform the running and planning of this service, including looking towards potential future trends in epidemiology. So there are a few data nationally or internationally on sarcoma epidemiology, and in Western Australia we have access to linked administrative data which are available to estimate disease burden. That's exactly what we did for this project. So the objective was to determine the incidence, prevalence, relative survival, and cost of cancer-related hospitalizations for sarcoma in Western Australia from 1982 to 2016, so quite a long time period. This next slide describes the data sources we use for the project, and for people listening from outside of Australia to orient you to the setting that this project was conducted in. This was undertaken using data from Western Australia, so the map of Australia, you can see that's on the left-hand side, and is quite a large area, so of about 2.6 million square kilometres. The data sources we used for the project were linked cancer registry, hospital morbidity, and death registration data. Specifically regarding the cancer registry data, so there is mandatory notification of all cancers in Western Australia. And for the sarcoma definition, we use the definition put forward by the Rare Care Net network, which is based in out of Europe, and a larger project looking at rare cancers in general. We had hospital data, so for all private and public hospital admissions from 1998 onwards, and these were linked with death registrations to allow assessment of 5-year relative survival. So the analysis approach in brief was to look at incidence per 100,000 population, and this was standardized to the European standard population. The reason for doing this was to allow comparison of our incidence data to that reported through the Rare Care Net study in Europe. Prevalence, which was calculated accounting for potential underreporting for people earlier in the study period, so acknowledging that people could be diagnosed prior to 1982 and they wouldn't be captured in this data set as being prevalent with sarcoma. Relative survival, so we looked at this for the 2012 to 2016 period using a period approach, and cancer-related hospital costs, and these were using Australian refined diagnosis-related groups. To give the data and orientation in more well-studied cancers, we had 4 reference cancers for this project. These were female breast, colorectal, prostate, and lung cancers. So moving to some results, and first of all looking at incidence. So there were 3,989 incident cases over the study period. And the figure on this chart divides the wider time period into smaller subperiods, which are along the x-axis, and we can see on the y-axis is the incidence per 100,000 population, age standardized to the European standard population. The different colors represent the broad sarcoma types that were included in this study. So in blue, soft tissue sarcoma; in red, bone sarcoma; in black, gastrointestinal stromal tumor, and you can see that these became a diagnostic entity during the study, so during the 90s, and also Kaposi sarcoma, which is in green. The most striking feature of this figure is that the incidence for soft tissue sarcoma was much higher than any of the other sarcoma types under study. And there was a changing age distribution for soft tissue sarcoma. So there was an increased proportion in people diagnosed at or above the age of 65 over the period, from 29% in 1982 to 1987, up to 39% for 2012 to 2016, although this needs to be interpreted in the context of an ageing population in Western Australia generally. There was an increased incidence in the later period, so in the last sub-period of 2012 to 2016, the incidence rate ratio compared to the first sub-period was 1.33. By contrast, you can see that for osteosarcoma, Kaposi sarcoma and gastrointestinal stromal tumor, that the incidence was more stable over the study period and was much lower in terms of magnitude. In terms of prevalence, this tells really a similar story. So on the y-axis, we have prevalence per 100,000 population at risk, and in the x-axis, we have the year at which prevalence is examined. So prevalence was counted as being alive and with a previous sarcoma diagnosis. And so all of these cases were not necessarily undergoing active treatment to be prevalent. Moving now to 5-year relative survival. So these data are for the 2012 to 2016, so the most recent sub-period. So we can see relative survival in terms of percentage along the x-axis, and along the y-axis are the types of sarcoma as well as the 4 reference cancers. So for the different types of sarcoma, soft tissue sarcoma had the lowest relative survival at around 65%. And this was quite variable depending on the site of soft tissue sarcoma in the body. So for example, soft tissue sarcoma of the retroperitoneum or of the uterus had a lower relative survival than soft tissue sarcoma of the extremities. Bone sarcoma had a higher sarcoma, although obviously a survival metric doesn't account for any morbidity associated with, for example, with amputation as part of management of a bone sarcoma. And the relative survival of gastrointestinal stromal tumors and Kaposi sarcoma was higher than the other 2 types. We can see that for the reference cancers, which are provided as a sort of reference point, that all of the sarcoma survivals were much higher than lung cancer at just less than 20% relative survival, but lower than colorectal cancer, female breast cancer, and prostate cancer for bone sarcoma and soft tissue sarcoma at least. In terms of cancer-related hospitalisation cost, in total in 2019 Australian dollars, this was just over 29 million over the study period. The mean cost per prevalent person increased from $675 in 1998 up until $1,728 in 2016. And this was the second highest of all the cancers looked at in terms of the reference cancers, which we can see ranged from 804 per prevalent person for female breast cancer up to just over $5,000 for lung cancer in 2016. So in terms of conclusions and implications, so soft tissue sarcoma incidence in particular increased over the study period, and there was an increasing proportion of people diagnosed at or above 65 years of age. There may be several reasons why this trend has been observed, including increased vigilance amongst primary care clinicians and a more clearly defined referral pathway over the study period. And this study adds to a relatively small literature analysing sarcoma epidemiology, especially in Australia, although this has been increasing over the past years. As I mentioned, the full paper is available through BMC Cancer, and I provided a link on the slide. And if you have any questions or to discuss, I'd be more than happy to engage with you via email. This study was funded in terms of data acquisition costs through the Abbey Basson Sarcoma Foundation, also known as Socket to Sarcoma, and Professor Associate Professor Halkett was supported by Cancer Council WA Research Fellowship during the time period for this work. I'd like to acknowledge the Data Linkage branch, the data custodians, and the people whose data have been analysed, as well as Dr. Peter Robbins, a pathologist at Pathwest, for advice. Thank you very much for listening.